Hi everyone, my name is Noah Cowan and I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins University. I do a wide range of research in robotics and neuroscience, and today I'm really excited to get started on a project that I'm doing during my sabbatical, which is creating 10 to 15 minute long deep dive journal club style presentations of the research that my students and postdocs and collaborators and I have done over the last 20 or so years. And to kick things off, we're going to look at the very first journal paper that I wrote way back when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan with the legendary PhD advisor Dan Kodacek, who's now actually at University of Pennsylvania. With that, let's get started. Hello everyone, I'm really excited to give a little journal club paper today on the very first journal paper that I actually ever wrote. This is work that if you go to my lab website, lims.lcsr.jhu.edu, you can click on the publications and you can see that I have my papers organized by reviews and preprints and so forth. And the very first journal article, way down at the bottom here, Visual Servoing via Navigation Functions. It appeared in IEEE Transactions on Robotics and Automation, which actually no longer exists as a journal. Now it's just IEEE Transactions on Robotics, and then there's IEEE Transactions on Automation. Well, I think that's what it is. Automation, Science, and Engineering or something like that. I can't remember. But just follow that link to the PDF. So Visual Servoing via Navigation Functions. This was when I was in Dan Kodacek's lab at University of Michigan. When he was, he was there for a few years after he left Yale, and now he's at Penn. But I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with him for my PhD. And, I think it's kind of useful to point out, this is 2002. This is, obviously after neural network architectures had been invented. I remember actually I had a graduate course that I took where Pramod Karganikar taught back propagation in 20 minutes in a lecture, and I thought, that's kind of a simple and interesting idea. Just use the chain rule and you can train this neural network, but never looked at it again subsequently. And now maybe people wouldn't approach problems in the way that I did in this paper, but it was really about thinking about the manifold of the sensory experience. So now there's this really popular hypothesis called the manifold hypothesis, which is that data coming into a robotic system lives on a low-dimensional some sort of low-dimensional submanifold. And this paper on visual servoing by navigation functions was all about identifying and mathematically characterizing the sensory manifold that you wanted to be sort of surfing in. So how do you surf your sensorium? You need to come up with a set of sort of a low parameter manifold representation of the sensory experience. And I just happened to do that using maybe old school classical techniques. Basically, I found a diffeomorphism between the space of rigid transformations and a subspace of movement of pixels on the sensorium. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about that, the sort of the technical details of that work. And the way I motivated it in this paper, and I'm just going to kind of go through the highlights of the paper. The way I motivated in that paper is that really simple idea. So if you have a sensor, C of Q, where Q is some underlying configuration variable, Q could be, Q in this case might be, for example, the 6 coordinates that define a rigid transformation. Then the classic approach at that time in visual servoing was to say, well, I'm going to map how those 6 configuration variables get transformed into a set of pixels on the screen, but I'm going to not think about the geometric interrelation for how those particles might move around. Instead, what I'm going to do is just treat that as a high-dimensional output mapping. In this case, I made a very simple example where it was just 4 feature points, the UV coordinates on the image plane of 4 features on the body. And then if you want to come up with a control law and you don't worry about dynamics, then what you can do is just follow the gradient of, sorry, not the gradient. In this, you could follow a gradient, but more generally, you come up with some desired movement of the set of image features on the image plane, and you pull that back through a pseudo inverse of the Jacobian matrix between the coordinates of your rigid body movement and the movement of the coordinates of the features on your screen through this pseudo inverse process. And this is the classic approach to visual servoing, known as image-based visual servoing. And the problem with that is that you run into all sorts of problems. So let's say your initial set of image coordinates, let's say you're looking at something like this die, and we're looking at the side of the die that has 4 points, and we assume the 4 points are distinguishable, and so I've highlighted that here by the fact that one is a different color. And what I want to do is I want to move them on the image plane from one initial condition to a final location. Ideally, my trajectory might look something like this, and that's the approach that I presented in the paper. But if you apply a naive Jacobian pseudo-inverse of a Jacobian sort of an approach, you might run the problem that your features will become invisible. And if you try a naive fix for that, you wind up hitting some local minimum and never getting to the goal, right? And so the normal approach of doing this up to that point didn't really take advantage of the geometry of the transformation between SE3, the space of rigid transformations, and some suitably defined image structure, the sensorial manifold, you might say. So not to get into all the technical details, but I just want to show an illustrative example that I think really makes it easy to see. So if we assume that we have a planar rigid body, and this is a two-dimensional world, so the rigid body is moving in x, y, and theta, or SE2, and we have a set of identifiable features on the body, and we'll assume for the purpose of simplicity that we're just looking at one face of this body. Then what I can do is I can project those feature points down onto the image line. It's now it's an image line rather than an image plane because I'm living in flatland. So if I project those feature points down onto the image line, they will, and I can cheat and draw the image line in front of the pinhole of the camera. Then I can see that as the rigid body moves around, these points move around. Well, in this particular pane, this particular example, one of the feature points is outside the field of view, so I can't see it. In this one, I wouldn't be able to see any of the points because they're on the dark side of the moon, so they're all occluded, so that the face is not facing the camera. And so these two images show a lack of what I called visibility in that work. And then if I can see all of the features and they're within the field of view and they're in the face of the camera, it's the light side of the moon, so to speak, is facing the camera, then I say that this are completely visible features. And what was really kind of a breakthrough for me is that I could actually define a set of coordinates in the image plane, y1, y2, and y3, that was diffeomorphic to the space of rigid transformations, so long as I constrain my rigid transformations to those in which this face, the normal vector to this face, which actually is written here by YB, as long as the projection of that normal is never becomes orthogonal to the line of sight, then this face remains facing the camera, and I maintain all of these points to be within some bounded interval and in the same order. That is the image plane manifold, which I define probably right about. Let me see where I define that in the paper. The image manifold is right here. As long as the 3 points lie in a line and are bounded above and below by some constraint without loss of generality, I just said plus and minus 1. This is the image space. This manifold is mathematically identical, and I should say it's topologically equivalent to the space of rigid transformations in the plane that keep all of the features visible. And it's a smooth and smoothly invertible transformation, which means I can actually write Lagrangian dynamics in these coordinates and then set up my constraints in that coordinate space and therefore avoid losing visibility even in a dynamic setting, sort of borrowing from ideas of Alain Ramon and Dan Kodacek on navigation functions. I can actually write Lagrange's equations in the image plane, define my boundary functions in the image plane, and then completely solve the visual servoing problem using this exact approach of navigation function theory machinery that was developed in the lab that I did my PhD, before I got there. And what was really, I would say, kind of exciting about this was that, and maybe this is a good tale for graduate students to see as well. A year earlier, I had written a really mediocre conference paper to ICRA in 1998 that had some of these ideas starting to take shape, but what I completely didn't understand was this idea of the diffeomorphism between image coordinates and SE2. I was working on a planar visual servoing problem at the time. And right before the deadline of ICRA 1999, ICRA is the International Conference of Robotics and Automation, right before that deadline, about 2.5 weeks before the deadline, I think it was, in August of probably 1998, I discovered a numerical simulation that proved the algorithm that I was trying to show was not correct. So I was trying to mathematically prove something about my old algorithm, and I found a numerical counterexample, and I got very depressed, and I drove down to Columbus, Ohio to visit my eventual wife. At the time, I don't even think we were engaged yet, but maybe we got engaged about a year later, just to kind of drive down to Ohio, kind of clear my head. And on the car ride down to Ohio, when I wasn't burdened by a computer or a paper and pencil, I suddenly realized that all the things that I had proven gave me the machinery I needed to prove that the space of visible transformations was equivalent to the problem of stringing beads on a wire. So if you think about Y1, Y2, and Y3 as beads moving back and forth on a wire, if I want to move those beads to a desired position, that's the problem. That's a problem that actually Dan Kodacek had solved, and I had read his paper. And so when I was driving home, I realized quite kind of amazingly in some way that the problem that I was trying to solve, I could reduce to a problem that my PhD advisor had solved. And up until that point, neither he nor I had any clue that that's what was really going on here, that what we really needed to be doing was not just trying to find a navigation function on the image space. What we were really trying to do is find a diffeomorphism from the task space to the image space, so that in that image coordinate system, we could then find the appropriate navigation function. Once I realized that these two problems were diffeomorphic, it became quite a simple matter to prove stability, because it had already been proved by Dan, actually in an even harder setting. So then I went on, later to generalize that with the help of Dongyi Chang, who was a postdoc at the time that I met at a conference, and so we generalized some of these ideas to SE3. And then my first career proposal, which failed, career proposal is the NSF mechanism for early career investigators, failed. I basically proposed the manifold hypothesis, but sort of using these concrete ideas of finding low-dimensional manifolds in the sensorium that you would then do control on. And it's kind of exciting that now, with the advent of AI and machine learning, people are kind of rediscovering, I would say, the ideas that were being developed, using old school tools, 20 years ago, including my own work, that are basically trying to discover these low-dimensional manifolds from data. So I still think there's a really important role in taking this more formal approach, but this kind of bottom-up engineering can meet with sort of the top-down, data-driven approaches that are being used today. And I kind of see that as like a really interesting frontier. So I did some experiments on this cool juggling robot. That was another example of, here's the robot configuration space is the 3 torus, because it's the rotation of the 3 joint angles. It's a subspace of the 3 torus because there's joint limits. But then if we put a camera there and project the end of the robot onto the camera image plane, it looks something like this. I put a little triangular reflector on the front of the robot. And then when you measure the position UV and orientation theta of the end of the robot, you can find a diffeomorphism between a subspace of joint angles and this subspace of the image plane. Again, finding a diffeomorphism between the task coordinates and the low-dimensional manifold, in this case just actually a subset of SE2, which is what the image plane is, and then you can define a so-called navigation function, again borrowing from ideas from Ramon and Kodacek. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be making more and more of these as I get a chance to go through my papers. Really kind of a, what I would say is kind of the, Jesus, fuck waffles. Ugh.